Welcome to Novelty, your destination for a deep dive into the intricacies of influence, politics, innovation, and so much more. I'm Levon Baronian, your host, and today we'll embark on a captivating exploration of soft power and its contemporary application, with a special focus on its dynamics in the Armenian context. Soft power, a concept elucidated by renowned political theorist Joseph Nye, represents the art of persuasion and influence through attraction and often manipulation, rather than through outright coercion or physical force. It's the subtle yet potent force that tries to shape international relations, molding perceptions, and attempting to win hearts and minds through cultural, economic, and ideological appeal. In today's episode, we'll attempt to peel back some layers of soft power, examining strategies and nuanced tactics employed by global actors, specifically Western powers. Most of us have heard about the exportation of cultural products, such as movies, music, and fashion, or the promotion of societal norms and values, but there are less overt mechanisms that are utilized to shape the global landscape in profound ways. We'll zoom in on Armenia, a nation at the crossroads of competing interests and geopolitical rivalries, to explore how soft power manifests in this complex geopolitical arena. We'll try to dissect some of the strategies employed by Western powers and institutions, such as the funding of civil society organizations and media outlets, to exert influence in Armenia and the broader implications this can have on regional stability. So join me as we navigate the intricate web of soft power dynamics, where the clash of interests and ideologies shapes the destinies of nations. My guest today is a good and longtime friend of mine, Ani Ma, who's a political analyst and a commentator. Thank you, Ani, for being here today with me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Levon.
All right. So we'll kind of get right to it. Ani, what are some of the means or mechanisms that global powers or regional powers, including our own country here, the United States, uses to exert soft power throughout the world?
So that's a really great question, and there are many mechanisms. You mentioned, Hollywood, for example, but I would add academia as well. But more recently, I think the strength of the European and Western United States exertion of power in other countries has been really via these non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And what essentially the United States used to do in its foreign affairs in conducting foreign diplomacy was via the State Department and the CIA. It really started realizing after probably the Kennedy assassination and the trouble that the U.S. had in South America with repeated regime changes and revolutions and armed conflicts, and the Church Committee aftermath, I think the United States realized that maybe using the CIA was not very conducive to its public image. So other organizations or initiatives like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, was born to try to sort of convert or change what the CIA was doing covertly into more sort of euphemistic, we're promoting democracy, we're helping third world countries be more open, et cetera, and we're going to support those efforts. And so the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a kind of part of the State Department, was born during the Cold War. But also, there are other NGOs, often funded by billionaires like George Soros with his Open Society, and also other governments. Governments essentially pay these, provide the funding for these non-governmental organizations, and then those NGOs then award grants to different initiatives that they'd like to support in foreign countries. And I think that when looking at it kind of globally, the situation is not unique to Armenia. We can certainly see where this power was exerted during the Arab Spring in Ukraine, as I mentioned, South America, Georgia, all over, all over the world. And essentially you can look at the funding and the amount of the funding and then realize it seems that most of the funding is going to countries where we know there is political upheaval, Sudan or Venezuela or Ukraine, et cetera.
So that's interesting. So you're saying that there's often a direct correlation of funding provided by these NGOs and then political upheaval happens afterwards. It's almost like a one-to-one relationship. Is it always the case, or is it in some places where the change happens more, let's say, gradually, or certain political parties might come to power or whatnot? Or is it always that after these types of activities that there's shocks that happen to these countries? Like, for example, in Ukraine, for the longest time, obviously, there was a lot of activity. Ukraine was a hotbed, but there wasn't a war, right? And we did see Maidan in Ukraine. We saw a colored revolution happen there, and it was kind of an open secret that the United States supported regime change in that country to have it tilt away from Russia and be more pro-Western. And today, Ukraine is on the doorsteps of NATO. But it took some time until it got to outright war. It was kind of a cold war, for lack of a better term, for quite some time. Now in Armenia, obviously, these types of organizations have existed for quite some time. They're not new. We know that you, for example, you mentioned Open Society foundations. We know that they've been in Armenia for almost 2 decades. And then you mentioned the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy. Now, you said it's kind of related to the State Department, but from my understanding, it's a nonprofit that's funded by
It is in the same state. The Congress provides funding for the NED through the State Department. It's in that chapter.
Okay. So what are some of the activities that the NED had been doing in Armenia prior, or even during this current regime in Armenia, or prior to the regime? What were some of their activities?
Sure. So you're absolutely right that this process is like an investment in regime change, essentially. And so they don't always manifest right away, the results. Oftentimes you kind of need to grow and strengthen that opposition movement to the regime. And in Armenia, it's certainly a case like that, where for decades, civil society was being kind of groomed and strengthened via these initiatives, and eventually it all came to a head, so to speak, in spring of 2018. So one mechanism by which the NED was really connected to the current regime was well, first, let me just briefly, clarify that when we said the connection with the CIA and we're talking about the State Department, this connection with the CIA is not something that we made up on the spot.
And it's not refuted either, right?
No, not at all. In fact, I have a quote here from previous presidents of the NED. Since the 80s, the president at the time, Carl Gershom, essentially said that NED was created in order to it would be terrible for democratic groups around the world to be seen as subsidized by the CIA. So instead, and Alan Weinstein, a subsequent president, also said that essentially their job is to make what the CIA was doing covertly into more overt action. But I feel that the best way to describe what happened in Armenia is to quote a very well-respected and beloved political character in the United States today, beloved by our generation, Dr. Ron Paul. Oh. He mentioned that. He said, the NED has this is a quote, the NED has very little to do with democracy. It is an organization that uses U.S. tax money to actually subvert democracy by showering funding on favored political parties or movements overseas. It underwrites color-coded people's revolutions overseas that look more like pages out of Lenin's writings on stealing power than genuine indigenous democratic movements. And I think that this is so succinct to what happened in Armenia. Because
so what happened? I mean, specifically, there have been reports that for years the NED supported different groups in Armenia. Do we have any specific facts on who or what the NED funded, or the Open Society, Sources Foundation funded in Armenia prior to 2018? Because other people have argued that Nikol Pashinyan, or this current regime, is actually potentially a Russian project, a Putin project. But I think there's facts that kind of point in a different direction, right? I think you might have some of these facts.
And I'd like to emphasize that I don't think one excludes the other.
Sure.
But we do certainly have ample documentation that just between 2014 and 2017 alone, Nikol Pashinyan's, under the guise of his newspaper and improving the newspaper of Հայկական ժամանակ and getting web presence.
That was the paper that he published, he and his family.
He and his family.
Հայկական ժամանակ.
Correct. So that paper alone for those 3 years, during those 3 years, garnered just under $120,000 from the NED. It was about 118, for the sake of transparency, it was about a little over $118,000 between 2014,
3 years.
2014 to
Nikol
2017.
Pashinyan's newspaper got 118,000 United States dollars from the National Endowment for Democracy, kind of not so secret CIA front.
Correct.
Is what you're saying.
Correct. And what's interesting is that for the 2017 grant, it specifically also stated that it's to report on the parliamentary elections and the city council elections. And I thought it was interesting that the owner, the editor of this newspaper, was he himself participating in those elections.
So there was a conflict of interest. One
would think, this is all, obviously the NED, probably the most common word you would see in their grants is corruption, exposing corruption, fighting corruption, spreading democracy. And it was interesting when I was, doing my research on this topic to see that they're granting so much money for corruption, and yet you're giving money to a candidate, both city council and parliamentary, and this money is being sent to an news organization that is supposed to be covering. But, I'd like to mention that, in my opinion, this is not so far-fetched. In fact, why, for example, is Nikol Pashinyan so beloved by these foreign funding organizations? And I think that, I was like I said, when I was doing my research, I was looking at what was their impression of Pashinyan as a political actor? And so for a little background, he kind of became prominent on the political scene in the late 90s. And he had another newspaper called Oragir, I think. And it was essentially just yellow journalism, kind of a political tabloid. And he
was the only person in Armenia's history to ever get convicted of, I think, libel, right?
That's what I'm getting to. I thought it was interesting that a 2001 State Department report on Armenia actually said that, this is a quote, "The editor of the sensationalist political tabloid Oragir and its successor Հայկական ժամանակ, Nikol Pashinyan, was found guilty in 1999 of libel, slander, libeling a public official, and contempt of court." And yes, he was the first.
And he never refuted those allegations. It wasn't like, the stuff that was in there was false. It was actual libel. Libel is very clear. You make a statement in written form that is patently false. So if what you're claiming is true, you present it, and it's almost a slam dunk. There's no opinions there. So
absolutely.
So he never backpedaled on the fact that he was publishing outright lies. So the State Department knew this about Nikol.
Yeah, and in fact, similar sentiments were expressed by Evans in a WikiLeaks cable. There was a mention of about this editor publishing news that never actually come to be born, so they noticed him as a person who's really willing to lie and just it has no qualms about it, and unfortunately that seems to be the kind of character, almost borderline sociopathic character, that the CIA often looks for in people that they want to work with. And I'm quoting this based on some recent podcasts I was watching of previous CIA analysts talking about, how they were recruited, et cetera. And many of them do mention that one needs to be a little bit unusual in their behavior and their character in order to be a good asset for these kinds of operations. So I feel that, he was not rewarded because he was such a truth teller, but rather that he was willing to do whatever in order to kind of gain approval or notoriety or whatever the incentives might have been at the time. Wow.
So the State Department already had Nikol Pashinyan on their radar in the early 2000s as a known liar. And a decade or so later, the National Endowment for Democracy starts funding his newspaper. And to do what? To talk about corruption in Armenia and democracy and whatnot. Yeah. So it's almost kind of like you're incentivized to talk about those topics and potentially even, increase, the so-called coverage of those topics. And if you're a known liar, you probably don't have any qualms about creating stuff too, right? I mean, there's some things that, for example, that current opposition, past regime in Armenia, either Robert Kocharyan or Serge Sarkisian, there are very kind of infamous allegations made against them that have been repeated by tens of, if not hundreds of thousands of Armenian citizens. For example, some of the funny ones I've heard, and I don't know if they're true, but that Kocharyan's family owns islands off of Greece, or owns like half of Yerevan.
Or the Sashik had 50% of everybody's stocks.
So were these things that came out of such newspapers as like Nicole's newspaper and other newspapers? And was there any funding?
So that's the thing, that's what's unfortunate is I don't know what the truth is, and neither do you, none of us do, but we know that there are these legends, and unfortunately, Nicole's not the only person who is well rewarded for essentially making such claims, political claims. Another journalist, like one of the more known investigative journalists, so to speak, or organizations in Armenia is HETK.
Okay.
And HETK was instrumental in publishing these like exposés on the ownership of, the Armenia's previous leaders owned, like you said, some lavish, properties, and basically they appropriated a lot of the state owned establishments and institutions for personal use or
Those
gain.
are the claims. Those
are the claims, and yet there's no evidence presented to back up those claims, and so that is what's unfortunate.
Was HETK also funded by these same entities like NED and Soros Foundations?
Absolutely, and in fact, what's interesting is that after the year where HETK published this huge expose where claiming that the Kocharyan family owned like 100% of Armenia, basically. Their funding increased to almost under $500,000 for that year. It was over 400, it was close to let's just say $400,000 for that year. It was like a 600-something% increase from the Open Society Foundation that this organization received in grant funding. Mm-hmm. And so, yet the only tangible connection that I saw from that reporting was some link to a Russian website where like a list of these properties were listed and claimed that it was owned by, government officials. And so while I don't know if that's true or not, I'm just sharing that there is no evidence. And so it's hard to, it's such a disservice that these organizations do when they fund yellow journalism, because they keep the public in darkness. We don't know what the truth is. And then you add to the mix another aspect of funding these media organizations. Before the revolution in 2018, other media organizations, SOS or Media Lab, and others, names are escaping me, but what I found was interesting was that you expect somebody who is called a journalist or is working with a media company to kind of sit like this and report some fact. Mm-hmm. But the reality was that they were actually like activists, and they would incite protests, physically be in the streets and use kind of tactics of the left, and under the guise of like from environmentalism to like LGBT rights, whatever.
But these people were actively getting funded by different NGOs. External to Armenia.
Foreign, yeah. And since we're talking about Western, I'm talking about Western
Is it
NGOs.
only just Western-funded NGOs, or do we see funding for these types of activities coming from other places, including Russia or other geopolitical players in that region, maybe China or India, or is it primarily Western-funded?
I actually, in all fairness, what I do appreciate about the Western funding is that there is some element of transparency. Mm-hmm. One can go to the NED website and see all the grants that have been awarded. One can go to the Open Society Foundation website and see all the grants that were awarded and read about the grants in detail, And so because there is transparency, which is a good thing, associated, I don't want to sound all critical all the time, but...
So it's an open secret.
It's an open secret, but what I'm saying is that because of that, we're able to see what is happening. So as far as, if other countries or other state actors are funding such efforts in other countries, like, for example, Russia, there is no website that I can go look up. And so perhaps there is,
There's a good point there.
And this is, I think that the Russian power in Armenia, for example, I think it kind of got grandfathered in after the Soviet Union. A lot of the law enforcement agencies, for example, they did get grandfathered in. So maybe their power is not as soft as civil societies, but more institutional. And of course, they do have, other, like Zatulin, he comes and he talks, and there are some diplomatic influence as well. But it's not as transparent in terms of just like funding a grant for a particular emphasis and then being able to say that this is the agenda that the grantees were pushing. Whereas with these organizations, it's very obvious that this is the agenda and this is what they're pushing. And I think the best way to sort of see what happened is see the switch between the same organization before March of 2018 and their actions after 2018.
Which one?
Any one of them.
They've changed? Their actions have changed?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because before the Color Revolution, these organizations that I mentioned, like SOS or Media Lab, et cetera, were constantly targeting and just hitting at the Armenian institutions that citizens kind of took pride in, that are the pillars of the country, and more specifically, let's say the armed forces, like the army.
Or the church, the institution of the church in Armenia.
Absolutely, and so even just the scent of malfeasance in any area was just overblown, which was great because if there is any kind of corruption, if there was any kind of, misappropriation, or especially when it came to the soldiers, if something bad happened to a soldier, please, by all means, blow the whistle. But what's interesting is that there was it wasn't only to just constantly paint the regime of the time in bad light, like they don't care about the soldier, they don't care about the army, they're fighting with with shovels, they don't have weapons, whatever. These really detrimental messaging that was going out. The benefit of it was at least there was, the government was realizing that we need to be accountable. So there is some benefit to this.
But it also turned Armenians in Armenia into one of the least happiest people in the world, I think. That probably contributed to it as well, the constant kind of criticism of the environment that they live in, the government, and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, and so the way these funding sources operate is they don't just make up a story. What they do is they like leech on to existing frustration, existing sentiment that's present in public. Of course, Armenia had corruption issues and still does. Of course, that is something
by some measure even more so now than before. But
sure, but what I'm saying is that they don't make up stories. They stick to actual. They try to find the public sentiment that is existing towards the current government. And they latch onto it, and they sort of really just start intensifying that message, and so they feed off of that energy and just make it bigger and bigger and bigger, and so that's how it culminates oftentimes with a successful revolution.
So why? The question. So there are these mechanisms in place. In some cases, they're covert. For example, in some cases they're overt. So, as you mentioned, at least the Western entities, there's some measure of transparency. We can go on there. There's open sources of information. You can see some of it. I'm sure not all of it. But the question is, why? Why so much attention in Armenia? In terms of Russia and the geopolitical players in that area, it's a little bit clear, right? Russia views Armenia as its zone of influence. Some argue that Russia views Armenia as still part of its kind of empire in many ways. But what are the interests of Western powers to be spending this much money and paying this much attention to a small landlocked country like Armenia that has no natural resources, doesn't really have oil? Why?
So when I was in the first grade in Armenia, I went to school there, and I remember I heard a phrase my teacher say as she was showing us maps of Armenia through the ages, starting from Tsovitsov to like the current, at the time, Soviet Armenia. And she used the word Garvakhanzor, meaning, kind of a point of contention and struggle. And so I don't feel that this is some new thing. Like Armenia may not have resources that we typically think of as, like Iraq with the oil or Syria with the pipelines, etc. But Armenia has a very strategic location, and one only needs to kind of look presently at our neighbors to recognize that we are at a geographic crossroads.
So let's zoom in a little bit more. I mean, not just the general stuff. Yes, geographic crossroads, always been there, but specifically in a more contemporary context, what are the interests of these various powers in Armenia right now specifically? Like, for example, in Ukraine, we see what's happening there, right? Obviously, Ukraine has made attempts to go toward the West. Some argue that that's only part of Ukraine that wants that, and part of Ukraine doesn't. But in Armenia, historically, Armenia has been kind of safely in the Russian orbit. But in recent years, things have changed. Some might argue that it's a result of the application of this sort of soft power. But like more specifically, what do you think are the reasons that Armenia is on the radar in such intense fashion in the last 10, 15, 20 years? What are the specific reasons?
I mean, I can only guess, but I think that, there is still a generation of American politicians who feel that Cold War breath, And while many more say that the United States' chief political rival globally is China, quite a bit more see Russia still as the number one threat to the U.S. And so any alliances that Russia has with other countries are potential targets for the subversion or creating a more, a drive to look west rather than
Is it
Russia.
Just Russia, though? I mean, obviously there's Iran there, there's
Absolutely.
Turkey there.
And so there is also another, contender, which is Iran. And I would assume that looking at Artsakh and Armenia and our location and our sharing of border with Iran, it is a pretty strategic location, given especially right now, as we sit here today, we are talking about it, waiting for an imminent response from Iran against Israel for the multiple, terrorist attacks that have occurred in Iran, who attributes this to Israel. So there is this tension for decades now where we're waiting for something to happen between Iran and Israel. Not to mention, the Project for American New Century and that old neocon sort of list of countries that they wanted to go after, with Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and Iran being the one that we have not yet as Americans have engaged with. So there's definitely the Iran connection. There's certainly also, there's a lot of pipelines and other resources that are being shipped. Not to mention there's also sanctions. Both Iran and Russia are under U.S. sanctions. So our proximity to those countries is definitely of interest, So I think that the reasons are many, and they would continue to evolve as the geopolitics in the world are changing.
Okay. Now, obviously, this isn't new. Countries have always tried to influence happenings in other countries. It's a form of diplomacy, one might argue. Why is it, at least my perception is that Armenia is extremely gullible, kind of vulnerable to this type of activity by foreign entities. What do other countries do, for example, to try to prevent meddling in their own internal politics by external actors? I know there are safeguards in the United States. Obviously there were accusations here that Russia meddled in the presidential elections here. We see some potentially meddling by China, but obviously there are safeguards, Israel. So can you talk about some of the safeguards that exist in the United States and other countries that potentially don't exist in Armenia?
Yeah, absolutely. The United States has the FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act. So any actor or institution that is lobbying on behalf of another country, with the exception of AIPAC, they do register as foreign agents. And DC is full of these companies and law firms who do lobbying on behalf of China and any country you can think of.
So they have to register in the United States as foreign agents.
Correct. So they have to be open about the interest that they're pursuing. And that's completely legal.
That includes media. For example,
RT, right, or any other foreign media. And so you're absolutely right. But in Armenia, we do not have that. And in fact, it's kind of it's not like it wasn't brought up either. I know Georgia is. This week, there was a lot of upheaval in Georgia over having a FARA-type legislation passed there. Incidentally, the individuals who were advocating for having some type of a safeguard like this implemented in Armenia are either kind of underground and hiding or in prison because their advocacy was not welcomed by the current administration. Narek Malyan is someone I can think of that was advocating for having a foreign agent registration type of policy implemented by to be brought to the parliament.
He's in prison.
Sorry?
Is Narek Malyan in prison right now?
Yes. Yes. In fact,
what are the charges?
I'm not exactly sure. They seem rather trumped up, but I'm not exactly sure. There is quite a large number of political prisoners in Armenia right now.
So these same entities that were, for example, the NED, Open Society Foundation, that were funding news outlets and individuals and organizations in Armenia to expose corruption, talk about lack of democracy, are they as active now? I mean, in Armenia, are they still kind of, putting the pressure on the current government, or you would expect if, that's what their interests were, that they would just continue to have the same level of activity? What do you see in Armenia right now?
So what I'm seeing is that, as I alluded to earlier, some of these media organizations that were so vocal and pinpointing any sort of, transgression by the government, they would just instantly organize protests in the streets and just voice their frustrations and write about them. Today, in my opinion, far worse things are happening in terms of human rights. I think there is a larger number of individuals who are in prison or at least under some kind of law enforcement investigations, etc. There is some sort of lawfare going on at a higher level than before, but these people are not saying a word. We had a tragic war where almost 5,000 of our soldiers were killed, and not a peep, and everything, just things were so smooth that there's nothing. By the same organizations that were screaming about, any sort of negative experience by soldiers during the, let's say, Sarkisian administration, So it's hard to see just the complete 180 where you would think that these advocates of the environment, they were organizing protests and at parks, etc. Now there is all kinds of damage to the environment and not a peep. And so I think that more systematically speaking, I'm not going to say that these funding sources realized, oh yeah, job well done, we're out of here. They still continue to support these efforts in order to maintain their foothold, but the tactics have changed. And in fact, we had Arman Grigoryan die during his trial, who was a political prisoner.
Arman Grigoryan was a producer, I believe.
Yeah, he was a filmmaker.
And he was facing charges of what? I think calling the Pashinyan regime Turks. I think that was the criminal charges.
It was, the way I would see it is just opposition activity.
But there was I remember the specific charge was something where he had made a comment where I remember what it was. It was basically that he had suggested that a large swath of the population in Shirak region have Turkish ancestry, and for that he was charged against some penal code in Armenia, and died while under arrest. Right? I think he was live on live
court.
television.
Yeah, it was very tragic to see. But my point is that the same people, actors, organizations that were championing freedom of speech, freedom to protest and express yourself, and hold your government accountable. Journalist organizations, they're not saying a word when they see the same.
Well, one of them is. I mean, just let's be fair. For example, I know Azatutun.am has been extremely critical, actually, in the last several months, if not even longer, of the Pashinyan regime. When you look at their articles, so to be fair, and that one is overtly funded by the United States. It's not even through NED or an NGO. It literally says on the website that it's funded by the United
Correct.
States.
It says actually a state fund. When we go on YouTube, there's that little Wikipedia little blurb that comes under RT, for example, and it does say U.S.
So it's interesting because there's some, especially anti-Russian pundits. A certain Chibukhchan comes to mind, who claims that the KGB must have infiltrated the Azatutun website because they've become a little bit more critical of Pashinyan and his regime in recent months. So to be fair, I mean, some of them have kind of stayed on the same line. Azatutun comes to mind. But I do see that as well, like that there are some institutions that beforehand were yelling and screaming. Like
Right. I'm specifically talking about the civil society, that faces and names that are so familiar to people, prior to 2018.
Like the people that were behind Electric Yerevan, like Arman Grigoryan.
Daniel Leonesyan, people who are advocates of civil rights, and yet when so many people's civil rights are currently being violated, they don't share a modicum of that same intensity of their arguments or their perspectives than they did at that time. And to be fair, Azatutun is also, it also functions as the voice of the United States establishment. And so sometimes their criticism is simply a message to, it is there to send a message to the regime also to kind of, here's the things we're not happy about too. And so while there is no direct grant-funded sort of relationship, like with the NED, they do still are the same arm of the same establishment. So I think one needs to pay attention to those if the tides are shifting.
Sure. One last question. As somebody, as a professional, my background's in computer science. I know that there are a lot of American companies, private companies, not NGOs, that are operating in Armenia. And I found interesting, for example, that in 2018, during the so-called Velvet Revolution, a lot of these American companies actually told their employees, and I have friends and colleagues that have told me this personally, that told their employees that if you want, we understand what's going on in Armenia, and if you would like to go out and participate in these, in the protests and in activities, we'll understand, and you can do so with pay. Yeah, so do you see that as also a mechanism of soft power, or are private corporations or public corporations also sometimes used as a mechanism of influencing in soft power?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, the U.S. is we're talking about all of these organizations that are designed to help fight corruption elsewhere. But we're not going to pretend that there is no corruption in the United States also, right? And we know this because there's a long documented history of, for example, the CIA. And I don't mean to be, just painting with a broad brush every single one of these companies that you're talking about in Armenia. I'm simply highlighting a phenomenon of these cutouts that are funded by, that are just CIA cutouts, going as far back as, say, the United Fruit Company, where the term Banana Republic came from. This was definitely, CIA was very actively involved in the United Fruit Company. And so this private-public kind of partnership via corruption is not news. So I don't know which specific company you may be referring to, but I won't be shocked to find out that there are some sort of, these fronts.
You raise a good point. I mean, even going back several hundred years, what was the big British company that was used as there's an extension of the British Empire? I forget the name right now. The British export company.
Like tea and India, something, yeah.
But that is a good point, that corporations have had a very intricate relationship with government institutions throughout, not just decades, going back centuries.
But at the same time, we are talking about typically like tech companies, et cetera. So maybe it's kind of that liberal woke ideology that perhaps could be permeating as well, where people feel that like these are our values, so feel free to go, So I don't mean to be really painting a broad brush, like with a broad brush, like I said. So I don't know what the intentions are, but I won't be surprised if there is an agenda that is being implemented through, corporations, or universities, or other sort of civil society and media organizations that do have relationships with foreign governments.
Very interesting. I think we can have a follow-up, discussion on a lot of the individual points that we talked about today, but that's kind of the time that we have for today. So I hope that our examination today of soft power and some of its application in Armenia has provided valuable insights into the complexities of global influence. By delving into the subtle mechanisms employed by the powers that be, from cultural exports to strategic funding, our goal today was to introduce our viewer to the nuanced dynamics shaping geopolitics. Sincere appreciation to our guest Anima for her invaluable contribution. Let's remain vigilant in our understanding of these forces, and that's, I think, the takeaway for today. Thank you for tuning in to Novelty. I'm Levon Baronian, and until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the novelty of the world around you. Thank you. Take care.